Hungary is not a big country. Its population is smaller than Moscow's. Its army is not decisive. Its economy does not determine the fate of Europe. And yet, the latest Hungarian elections mattered far beyond Budapest. Because Viktor Orbán was never just Hungary's leader, he was something much more useful to the Kremlin, Putin's man inside the West. Not literally, not as a puppet in the cartoon sense. Something more effective than that. A European leader who could sit inside the EU and NATO, speak the language of sovereignty and realism, show support for Ukraine, defend Russian energy ties, and help Moscow tell one of its favorite stories. Not all of Europe is against us. That made him valuable. So when Orbán lost, this was not just a Hungarian political upset. It was a symbolic blow to the Kremlin's whole European narrative and a practical loss for one of the few leaders inside the EU who kept making life easier for Moscow. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union, and today I want to show you why losing Hungary hurts Putin this much, what Orbán was really doing for the Kremlin, why that mattered so deeply, and what may change now that one of Moscow's most useful allies is gone. Here's our roadmap. Why Hungary mattered. Why Budapest became so useful to the Kremlin. The Russian levers. How Moscow built influence in Europe through energy, networks, and fear. Orbán's long turn. How a young anti-communist became Putin's most useful partner in the EU. The Hungarian myth, why Orbán mattered so much to Putin's domestic image. The Budapest Shock, why the election result hit so hard in Moscow. What really changes, why Hungary may do next, and what it probably won't. If you value this kind of independent analysis, subscribe, like, and share. You can also join my think tank, support through PayPal or Super Thanks, or tap Hype Points. And if you are listening on Spotify, please follow the show there too. It really helps. Now, let's begin with the first question. Why did one mid-sized Central European country matter so much to the Kremlin in the first place? Why Hungary mattered. For years, the Kremlin needed two things from Europe: money and respect. Money because Russia's ruling system lives on trade with the outside world, especially on selling raw materials. Respect because Putin's regime has always craved recognition from the West, even while pretending to despise it. The perfect outcome for the Russian elite was make money in Russia, spend it in Europe, and be left alone to rule however they pleased at home. That dream started breaking down after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Relations collapsed. Europe began slowly and painfully to reduce its dependence on Russian energy. But even then, Moscow still had a few useful voices inside the European Union, and Orbán was the loudest of them. That was his real value. Not military power or wealth, but his political position. Orbán could slow decisions at the EU level or even veto them. He could bargain and win time. And in politics, time matters. If Ukraine needs help now, but one man inside the EU can delay that help for weeks or months, then he becomes very useful to the Kremlin. And Orbán was useful in exactly that way. He repeatedly opposed or delayed EU support for Ukraine. He fought with Brussels over sanctions. He defended Russian energy ties long after those ties had become politically toxic. He kept presenting himself as the last realist in a continent supposedly driven mad by liberals, bureaucrats, and war hawks. That made him valuable for the Kremlin's foreign policy. But he was even more valuable as part of the narrative they spread inside Russia. Like any authoritarian regime, Putin's rule needs to constantly prove its legitimacy with a story that people will believe. It must be something they'd want to believe. For example, that history is on Putin's side, that he still knows how to divide his enemies. He still has partners in the West, and not everyone in Europe sees him as a criminal and a failure. This story makes people feel safe and proud of their wise and respectable leader. Hungary was a cornerstone of this story. As long as Orbán remained in place, Russian television and pro-Kremlin commentators could say, look, not all of Europe is against us. There are still sensible people who understand and support Russia. That is why the election on April 12 hit so hard. Orbán did not merely lose. He conceded. After 16 years in power, he had to admit defeat to Viktor Mattered and his TSO party. And suddenly, one of the Kremlin's favorite examples no longer worked. A story that Putin was still a player in Europe suddenly gave a crack and started falling to pieces. The Russian levers. Putin built his influence in Europe with 3 levers. The first lever was energy. This was the easiest one because it rested on old infrastructure and old habits. Much of Central and Eastern Europe had been wired quite literally into Soviet supplies that Russia inherited. Hungary is a good example of how pipelines shape politics. Budapest had signed a 15-year gas deal with Gazprom back in 2021, just before the war. And even in 2024, Orbán was openly saying he was not going to walk away from Russian gas. The second lever was political cultivation. This part does not always mean a suitcase full of cash. Sometimes it means flattering attention, business opportunities, or the quiet understanding that cooperation with Russia can be personally rewarding. Germany is one of the clearest examples. For years, Nord Stream was presented as nothing more than a business deal, a set of gas pipelines built to carry Russian natural gas directly to Germany under the Baltic Sea. But it was political from the start, because it increased Europe's dependence on Russian energy and gave Moscow more leverage over the continent. To help keep Nord Stream 2 alive when US sanctions threatened the project, a state-backed climate foundation in the German region of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern was used as a political shield. Italy offered another version of the same disease. In 2019, prosecutors opened an investigation after reports that associates linked to Matteo Salvini's league had discussed a possible Russian oil deal that could have diverted money to the party. The deal was never completed, but this episode reveals Moscow methods perfectly. And then there was the third lever, fear. It was probably Putin's favorite because it was cheap and endlessly reusable. You feed every anxiety that already exists in the society. Fear of migrants, of war, of inflation, of American dominance, of losing national identity. You just need to amplify them and tie them to one political message. Liberal Europe is chaos. Compromise with Russia is stability. Orbán became a master of this language. He presented himself as the defender of the nation against Brussels, migrants, gender ideology and outside pressure. And this made him extremely useful to Moscow because he was translating Kremlin-friendly instincts into local Hungarian politics. That is why Hungary was such a prize. It combined all 3 levers in one place. Energy dependence, a leadership willing to do business with Russia, and a political style built on fear, grievance, and permanent conflict with the liberal West. Putin did not create Orbán. That would be too neat. but he recognized a useful man when he saw one. Orbán's long turn. Viktor Orbán's story of rise to power is very common for post-communist countries and tragic. Orbán first entering politics as the opposite of a Soviet-style strongman. He was young, liberal, anti-communist, and openly anti-Soviet. In 1989, he became famous for demanding that Soviet troops leave Hungary. But later, this anti-communist hero drifted far from his early liberal views and became a nationalist icon admired by the European far right. Over time, Orbán started speaking the language of sovereignty and cultural siege. He built what he himself called an illiberal state. In 2018, he said that Christian democracy is not liberal, and even added, it is illiberal, if you like. That was a declaration of direction. And once you take that road, Putin stops looking like a historical enemy and starts looking like something else, a fellow practitioner, a man running a similar machine. Orbán's Hungary and Putin's Russia were never equal in scale. One is a 9 million EU state, the other a nuclear empire with oil and gas. But the political style began to rhyme. Both men spoke about sovereignty while narrowing pluralism at home. Both treated liberal institutions as obstacles. Both presented themselves as defenders of the nation against foreign contamination. This is where Orbán became precious to the Kremlin. He was not some fringe radical shouting outside the gate. He was inside the European Union, inside NATO, sitting at the table, speaking the language of legitimacy and still pushing themes that suited Moscow perfectly. The Hungarian Myth. As long as Hungary kept resisting Brussels on Ukraine, Russian elites could tell themselves a comforting story. Europe is not united. The West is tired of supporting Ukraine. There are still reasonable people inside the EU who side with us. Putin is still outplaying his enemies. Autocracies live on that kind of mood. They rule by prestige. The bureaucrats, propagandists, businessmen, and security men around the ruler need to feel that he is still lucky and effective, that he's in control and keeps things running as they should. When that aura weakens, fear changes direction. People stop fearing the outside world and start fearing that their own leader may be losing his grip. Hungary helped postpone that feeling. Orbán was especially useful because he was visible, constantly on the European stage. Every time he delayed EU action, quarreled with Brussels, defended Russian energy, or framed Ukraine aid as reckless, he was doing work for the Kremlin's internal mythology. He was proof, for example. And then the election came. Orbán's defeat removed Ukraine's staunchest foe inside the EU and raised hopes in Kiev that Budapest would stop blocking support packages and sanctions. That is the practical side of the story, but the psychological side may matter even more for Moscow. One of Putin's most prized assets is gone. Worse still, Orbán conceded. From a democratic point of view, that is normal. But for autocrats, losing office is humiliation. It means that you are weak and fail to dominate the field. The admired strongman in that world is someone who refuses to step down ever at all. The model is Lukashenko in Belarus, clinging to power through force. That is why Orbán's defeat feels doubly bitter in Moscow. Putin lost not just an ally, but an ally who, in the end, behaved like a European politician rather than a true post-Soviet autocrat. The Budapest Shock. What made the Budapest blow even harder for the Kremlin was its timing. Before the election, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service openly claimed that some in the EU were helping Orbán's rivals. That alone tells you how emotionally invested Moscow had become in this contest. The Kremlin was no longer pretending Hungary was merely another sovereign democracy making its own choices. It was casting the race in the familiar paranoid style: foreign enemies, plots, manipulation, betrayal. At the same time, independent research showed coordinated pro-Orbán messaging on Telegram, important Russian or Russia-affiliated sources helping seed the narratives. Analysts described Russian-style content being translated and adapted into Hungarian channels. Moscow was pushing the information climate in Orbán's favor, but it didn't help. Then came the result. Russian bloggers and war supporters reacted with alarm because Orbán's defeat threatened one of the Kremlin's few remaining footholds inside the EU. They worried Hungary would stop blocking support for Ukraine, obstructing sanctions and serving as a brake on Brussels. And this is where the story becomes very Russian. In Russia, power is judged not only by force, but by luck. A ruler who keeps winning gathers followers even when his decisions are foolish. A ruler who starts losing allies, opportunities, and momentum begins to look vulnerable even before anything dramatic happens. That is why Putin's circle hates symbolic defeats. A lost battle can be explained away. Economic problems can be blamed on sanctions, but the slow evaporation of the ruler's lucky aura is much harder to manage. What really changes? Now, let's look at what Orbán's defeat is changing and what it doesn't. Viktor Orbán is not promising a crusade against Moscow. He plans to maintain pragmatic ties with Russia as he focuses first on Hungary's internal issues, such as fuel supply, frozen funds in EU banks, a damaged media system, and institutions packed with Orbán loyalists. So the honest answer is this: Hungary will probably become less useful to the Kremlin long before it becomes genuinely useful to Ukraine. And that alone is a big change. If Hungary stops jamming every important decision, Europe becomes more coherent. That is the first real consequence. The second is psychological and maybe even larger. Orbán's defeat reminds Europe of something many people had begun to forget. Democratic correction is still possible. Governments can overreach, poison institutions, flood the public sphere with propaganda, and still be removed if elections remain real enough. That is the lesson the Kremlin fears most, because authoritarian systems sell one basic promise. Yes, freedom is messy, but at least we are stable. Yes, our methods are harsh, but at least we endure. Yes, liberal democracy makes mistakes, but once the strong hand arrives, it stays. Hungary just reminded everyone that the strong hand can sleep. And that matters far beyond Budapest. For years, Europe went through a familiar cycle. Democratic governments made mistakes. Voters became angry. Strongman politics grew attractive. Leaders like Orbán presented themselves as tougher, saner, more down-to-earth, more masculine, more national. Then the same leaders, once secure in power, started breaking institutions more aggressively than the liberals they mocked. They centralized media, hollowed out courts, and turned fear into a permanent background. And slowly the public got tired of the show. This does not happen everywhere. It cannot happen in Russia because Russia no longer has the mechanism. It can happen only where elections still mean something. That is why Hungary's vote is an example that Kremlin cannot tolerate. Because once people see that the country can correct itself without collapsing, the whole authoritarian sales pitch starts to look a lot less impressive. Before you go, I want to ask you something simple. Did Orbán's defeat surprise you? Or did you feel it coming? And what do you think mattered more? Hungarian voters getting tired of him, or the image of a strongman simply wearing out? If this video helps you see the Budapest result more clearly, please like the video and subscribe. Share it with one person who still thinks Hungary was just a local election with local consequences. And if you want to support this work directly, you can join my think tank or use PayPal or Super Thanks. You can also tap high points to help this episode travel further. And if you are listening on Spotify, follow the show so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching. See you next time.